Picture yourself at just 12 years old, draped in layers of silk embroidered with threads of gold, your head weighed down by jewels so heavy they ache against your temples. All around you, nobles, generals, and scholars gather in celebration. They raise their cups not for you as a person, but for what you represent, an alliance sealed in flesh and blood. Today is your wedding day, but there's no joy in your chest, no butterflies of excitement for a future spouse, only dread, because when night falls, you will step into a chamber where your life will be rewritten by a man 3 times your age. You've only seen him once before. Tonight, he will decide not just your future as his wife, but your worth to an empire. This is not a story of romance. It is a story of power, politics, and fear. You are a daughter of the Ottoman dynasty, and your wedding night is less about love than it is about survival. The empire stretched across 3 continents, ruled trade routes, and commanded armies that terrified Europe. Yet behind the battlefields and golden palaces, another system was just as ruthless: the marriage machine, a network where girls like you were currency, and where a bed of silk sheets became the stage for imperial negotiations. Forget fairy tales of noble weddings. These ceremonies were business transactions dressed up as celebrations. Every smile, every jeweled gown, every ritual hid the brutal reality that a young girl's body was the glue holding together treaties, loyalties, and dynasties. And you, an imperial princess, were expected to know this from the moment you could speak. From the second a girl was born inside the palace walls, she was no ordinary daughter. She was a potential alliance, a living treaty, a breathing guarantee of loyalty. Her father did not see a child in the cradle. He saw a future tool to bind generals, governors, or foreign rulers to the throne. Everything in her life was preparation for that fate. Tutors taught her not only to read and write, but to recite Persian poetry, because cultured wives impressed ambassadors. Music lessons were less about enjoyment and more about pleasing future husbands. Even her posture at meals, the way she greeted visitors, the tilt of her head when listening, every detail was drilled into her until she became the perfect political weapon. But here lies the cruel twist. Unlike European princesses who were married off and became submissive to their husbands immediately, Ottoman princesses stood higher in rank than the men they married. On paper, this gave them authority. They could control their households, refuse physical intimacy, even deny their husbands entry into their chambers. Sounds like power, doesn't it? In reality, it was a curse, because with that authority came unbearable pressure. It was not enough for a girl to simply survive her wedding night. She had to balance her husband's pride with her own rank, to grant intimacy but not too quickly, to show strength but not so much that it humiliated him. A single misstep could spark not just domestic conflict, but political chaos. The eyes of the court watched everything. Would she bend, or would she rule? Would she prove valuable to the empire, or bring shame upon her lineage? The ceremonies leading up to the night made sure she never forgot what was at stake. These weren't parties for joy. They were spectacles of wealth meant to broadcast the empire's dominance. Guests marveled at weeks of feasts, processions, and exhibitions. The dowry displays in particular were a cruel performance. Imagine being barely a teenager, sitting in a hall as attendants paraded treasures that symbolized your value. Rugs woven so fine they could pay for villages. Necklaces heavy with diamonds and emeralds that could bankroll armies. Gowns so intricate dozens of craftsmen spent months creating them. And yet, none of it mattered as much as the one thing you could not parade: your virginity. That single trait eclipsed every jewel, every carpet, every coin. The empire calculated a girl's worth by whether her purity was intact. The larger the dowry, the more valuable her untouched body was considered. The message was clear: your blood on the wedding sheets could mean the survival of your family's honor, or its downfall. Nowhere is this more horrifying than in the story of Layla Hanum, the young daughter of Sultan Mahmud II. At just 6 years old, she was wed to a governor in his 40s. Too young to even comprehend what marriage meant, she was draped in wedding attire and presented before an audience that cheered the alliance. The union remained unconsummated for nearly a decade, not out of mercy, but because she would not have survived childbirth. But those years were not a reprieve. They were a slow, torturous countdown. From the moment she could understand words, she knew her body was promised. Every year she grew, she lived under the looming shadow of a night she could not stop. By 13, the time had come. Her first husband had died in war, and almost instantly, she was remarried to another man nearly her father's age. This time, the expectation was clear. The marriage bed must be fulfilled at once. The chamber where it happened was no private retreat. It was a stage. Religious officials had blessed the room, attendants had decorated it with symbols of fertility, and guards stood just outside the doors. Everyone waited for proof that the union had been sealed. For the girl stepping inside, there was no escape. To fail that night was to risk disgrace, rejection, even death. To succeed was to surrender her childhood forever. And this was just the beginning. What awaited these young brides after that first night would reveal even darker realities, rituals, humiliations, and expectations that turned marriage into a lifetime of surveillance and political exploitation. The first night was never the end. It was only the curtain rising on a performance that would stretch for years. If the wedding chamber was a stage, then the morning after was a tribunal, because when dawn broke over the palace, the most private act of a girl's life became the empire's business. It wasn't enough that she had endured intimacy with a stranger, often through fear and trembling. She now had to produce evidence. Literal, physical proof that the marriage had been consummated. Servants would collect the bedsheets and carry them through the palace like trophies. Blood-stained linen was not a symbol of love. It was a contract, a certificate that the princess's body had fulfilled its purpose. And the audience was staggering. Palace officials examined the fabric. Religious authorities weighed in on its authenticity. Foreign diplomats waiting in Istanbul might even receive reports, so they could confirm that the alliance sealed in the wedding was now binding in flesh. This was not romance. It was bureaucracy written in blood. But what if something went wrong? Not every girl bled on her wedding night. Some had fragile bodies that tore earlier through accidents or simple biology. Others were so terrified that their bodies refused to cooperate. Still others were simply unlucky. In the Ottoman court, luck could be fatal. A bride who failed to produce blood faced suspicions of impurity. Whispers of lost virginity spread like wildfire, poisoning reputations overnight. For a European princess, this might mean shame. For an Ottoman princess, it was treason. Because her body wasn't hers, it was a contract between empires. If she appeared damaged, the entire agreement could collapse. Her family risked disgrace, her father risked rebellion, her husband risked humiliation, and she risked her life. There are records of girls who vanished from palace chronicles after their wedding nights. Their names erased, their fates unrecorded. Officially, they ceased to exist. In reality, many were likely eliminated to erase the shame their bodies had supposedly brought upon the empire. Those who did bleed were not spared either. Their suffering simply took on new shapes. The sheets themselves became artifacts. They were stored, catalogued, sometimes even brought forward years later in legal disputes about inheritance or succession. A piece of cloth, stained by a terrified teenager, could decide the fate of armies. It is difficult for modern minds to comprehend. But in a world where a princess's purity was valued above gold, her most intimate pain became evidence in courts of law. To make matters worse, the princesses were judged not only for their blood, but for their reactions. Doctors of the time believed that a woman's sexual response revealed her fertility, her morality, even her loyalty. If she appeared too cold, she was branded barren, unfit to produce heirs. If she showed too much pleasure, she was considered dangerous, untrustworthy, even sinful. The perfect bride had to perform an impossible balance, modest yet responsive, pained yet obedient, frightened yet willing. This grotesque theater of femininity crushed girls barely in their teens, forcing them to act roles that even seasoned courtesans would struggle to master. The court developed its own twisted solution. Preparation schools for terror. Older concubines, former wives, and palace advisors became instructors. Their job? To train the young girls for their wedding nights. They taught them how to breathe, how to sigh, how to weep at just the right moment. They explained where to place their hands, how to tilt their heads, which expressions to fake. Most disturbingly, they trained them in deception. Girls were given animal blood concealed in pouches to stain sheets if their bodies did not cooperate. Others were taught to scratch themselves with hidden needles during the act, ensuring at least a trickle of red. Imagine being 13 years old, sitting cross-legged before a former concubine who instructs you on how to mutilate yourself in order to survive the morning after. This was not guidance. It was indoctrination into a system of abuse so refined, so normalized, that victims became the teachers who passed it on. Religion added another layer of cruelty. In theory, Islamic law emphasized consent. A woman had the right to refuse intimacy. But inside the palace, these protections were twisted into burdens. Yes, a princess could delay consummation, but only by presenting excuses acceptable to the empire. Too much piety suggested she was criticizing the marriage. Claiming physical weakness implied infertility. Admitting emotional distress branded her unstable. Every reason carried political risks, so the girl was forced to play theologian, doctor, and actress all at once, carefully calibrating her resistance in ways that wouldn't offend her father, her husband, or the religious scholars who oversaw her life. Consent became not freedom, but another performance, one with stakes as high as war and peace. Even after the rituals of proof were completed, the nightmare did not end. The marriage chamber became a surveillance zone. A princess gained her own household after marriage. In theory, it was a place of protection. In reality, it was a gilded prison. Her servants were not just attendants, they were spies. They reported on everything: her moods, her arguments, her menstrual cycles, her attempts to conceive. Bed sheets were checked, whispers recorded, and rumors passed directly to palace officials. Privacy ceased to exist. The walls themselves seemed to have ears. Even when a princess tried to form genuine intimacy with her husband, she lived in fear that a careless word might be twisted into evidence of disloyalty. Trust became impossible. Love became dangerous. The very people who brushed her hair, served her food, and tucked her into bed might be writing reports that determined her fate. Above all, the pressure to conceive weighed like a stone. Producing heirs was the ultimate measure of success. Each month that passed without pregnancy marked her as a failure. Each miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death was blamed on her body. Doctors prescribed brutal remedies, starvation, diets, invasive procedures, even surgeries that left lasting scars. Instead of easing suffering, medicine magnified it. Girls who had once feared their wedding nights now feared their wombs, watching their bodies betray them in front of a court that treated fertility as currency. For those who succeeded in producing sons, survival did not guarantee peace. Instead, they stepped into a new labyrinth of power struggles, because in the Ottoman system, a princess's children became political weapons too, and their very existence could spark rivalries that ended in blood. For the rare princess who survived the terrors of her wedding night, the struggle was far from over, because marriage inside the Ottoman court was not a destination, it was a battlefield. Once the morning after rituals were complete, she entered a new role not simply as a wife, but as a strategist in a game where her body, her children, and even her emotions were measured like pieces on a chessboard. Every glance, every word, every pregnancy carried political consequences. Her private life had never been hers, but now it was dissected with surgical precision by the palace machinery. On the surface, these women appeared powerful. Unlike European queens who often submitted to their husbands, Ottoman princesses outranked their spouses. Their chambers were guarded, their households independent, their authority unquestioned. But appearances were the empire's greatest weapon. What looked like privilege was, in truth, a cage. The so-called freedom of refusing intimacy or managing a household became another stage for performance. Every choice she made was interpreted by rivals, recorded by attendants, and judged by officials. A refusal of her husband's advances might signal strength or insult him into rebellion. A display of tenderness might bind him closer or weaken her authority. It was a constant balancing act, and one miscalculation could ignite political disaster. Nowhere was this tension sharper than in the demand for children. A princess's womb was not hers, it was property of the empire. Each month without pregnancy rang alarm bells. Each childless year invited whispers of failure. Her menstruation became public knowledge. Attendants counted the days, physicians probed her health, whispers spread about her fertility. A miscarriage was not a personal tragedy, it was a political catastrophe, blamed on her weakness, her morality, her very worth. Doctors of the time offered remedies that ranged from bizarre to brutal. Herbal brews laced with dangerous substances. Painful surgical instruments inserted under primitive conditions. Restrictive diets designed to balance humors, but that starved the body. The empire's ignorance of medicine turned women's suffering into endless experiments. Instead of compassion, they received suspicion. Instead of healing, they endured torture disguised as treatment. And if she did conceive, new horrors began. Because a child was not simply her son or daughter. That infant was a political symbol, a pawn in the endless struggle for succession and influence. A boy could strengthen her position but also make her a target. Rivals might spread rumors about his legitimacy, whisper doubts about his paternity, even plot his removal. A girl was less valuable politically, yet her survival still mattered. She would eventually become another pawn, another treaty wrapped in silk. Thus, even motherhood, an experience that should have offered joy, became another arena of fear. Surrounded by this pressure, the most successful princesses learned to adapt. They became masters of manipulation, turning the system that consumed them into a tool for survival. They mastered the art of performance. To their husbands, They appeared submissive yet firm, grateful yet commanding. To the court, they projected piety, strength, and fertility, even when racked with fear or illness. Their lives became theater. Authentic emotion was too dangerous to reveal. Real love was too fragile to risk. Instead, they wore masks so convincing that even they began to lose track of who they were beneath them. It's tempting to think that power softened their lives. But in reality, power only sharpened their isolation. A princess could command armies of servants, yet she could trust none of them. Every handmaid might be a spy. Every whisper could be a report. Even the women who brushed her hair and dressed her in jewels could be recording her words for officials. This constant surveillance bred paranoia that poisoned even moments of peace. Imagine living in a palace of marble and gold, knowing that every corridor echoed with footsteps listening for your secrets. The walls did not protect her. They betrayed her. And the cruelty of the system did not end with strangers. It replicated itself from woman to woman. Senior princesses who had endured their own traumas often became the enforcers, teaching younger girls how to endure wedding nights, how to bleed on command, how to perform the roles demanded of them. They convinced themselves they were protecting the next generation, but in reality, they were perpetuating the very cycle that had destroyed them. Victims became jailers, trauma became tradition. The harem was not just a prison of men's making. It was a machine in which women, broken by their own suffering, became gears that turned against each other. Some tried to resist. There are scattered accounts of princesses who refused marriages, who attempted to flee, who sought to defy the machinery of empire. But rebellion carried swift punishments. Refusal often led to exile or worse, a quiet execution whispered about but never written down. Escape attempts ended with public humiliation, designed to frighten others into obedience, and even those who managed to survive with some semblance of happiness lived under constant fear, because love, too, was a liability. A husband who grew too close could be removed by the Sultan, executed or reassigned to prevent him from amassing independent power. A marriage that seemed stable could be shattered overnight if politics demanded a new alliance. In the Ottoman palace, nothing was permanent. Not love, not peace, not even family. For the young princess trapped in this system, survival meant one thing: becoming someone else. She had to bury her true self, her desires, her fears, her innocence, and replace them with a mask that could withstand the empire's scrutiny. She was no longer a child, no longer a daughter, no longer even a person. She was an institution, a vessel, a weapon dressed in silk. The cost of survival was her humanity. The greatest cruelty of the Ottoman marriage system was not the physical pain, nor even the fear. It was the illusion. From the outside, the life of a princess looked like paradise. She lived in marble halls, dressed in gowns woven with silver thread, surrounded by servants, jewels, and gardens. To foreign visitors, she seemed the embodiment of privilege. But what appeared as luxury was carefully designed camouflage. Beneath the gold and silk, these women lived in prisons more sophisticated than chains and bars. The empire did not just control their bodies, it controlled their perception of reality. Every ritual, every custom, every story reinforced the same message. Your suffering is honor, your pain is privilege, your cage is a palace. A princess who wept at her wedding night was told she was lucky to serve the empire. A girl who bled onto the ceremonial sheets was praised for her loyalty. A wife who endured endless pregnancies and miscarriages was honored as the mother of dynasties. In this way, trauma became tradition, abuse became duty, and resistance became unthinkable. The psychological toll was immense. Modern minds might recognize the symptoms as trauma disorders, nightmares, anxiety, paranoia, emotional detachment, but in the Ottoman court, these were seen as flaws of character. A princess who withdrew after a brutal wedding night was scorned as ungrateful. One who hesitated in intimacy was branded defective, a liability to political alliances. Even those who showed resilience were accused of arrogance or rebellion. There was no vocabulary for trauma, no compassion for suffering. Instead, the very symptoms of abuse became evidence of failure, and perhaps the most devastating of all was how the cycle repeated. Broken women, unable to heal, often became the very instruments of the system. Older princesses instructed the younger ones in the rituals of performance. They passed on the same lessons of self-mutilation, the same techniques of deception, the same rehearsed behaviors. They told themselves they were preparing the girls for survival, but in truth, they were perpetuating the system that had destroyed them. Victims transformed into teachers of victimhood. Survivors became enforcers. It was a cycle so perfect in its cruelty that the empire barely needed to intervene. Women controlled women, trauma replicated itself, and the system continued. Resistance was rare and dangerous. The few who dared to protest faced swift and silent punishment. Some were banished to remote estates, stripped of their households, cut off from the power that once surrounded them. Others simply disappeared, erased from records, as though they had never existed. Even whispers of defiance were enough to brand a princess as disloyal. And yet, the desire for freedom never entirely disappeared. Hidden in letters, in poetry, in songs, fragments of longing can be found words that suggest some women still dreamed of a life beyond the palace walls. But those dreams rarely became reality. The tragedy was that even genuine happiness could not be trusted. On the rare occasion a princess found companionship with her husband, that love became another weapon in the empire's arsenal. If her spouse grew too independent, he might be reassigned or eliminated. If the marriage stabilized too firmly, the sultan could intervene, disrupting it for political purposes. Love was not a refuge, it was a liability. The more joy a woman found, the more precarious it became. Imagine living with the constant fear that your happiness might be revoked not by fate, but by decree. What made this system so effective was its sophistication. It was not a crude tyranny of chains and whips. It was a theater of power, built on illusions and rituals, reinforced by culture, religion, and tradition. The palace convinced its victims that they were privileged, that their cages were sanctuaries, that their pain was noble sacrifice. And in doing so, it robbed them not only of freedom, but of the very ability to recognize their own suffering. The impact rippled through generations. Princesses who survived their own ordeals raised daughters who would face the same fate. Sons, too, grew up in a system where women were tools, where intimacy was politics, where love was secondary to empire. The marriage machine did not simply consume women, it reshaped the entire culture of power, and its legacy did not end with the fall of the empire. The belief that a woman's worth could be measured by her purity, that her wedding night determined her value, that her body was an instrument of political or social control. These ideas endured for centuries, seeping into laws, customs, and attitudes far beyond the walls of Istanbul. The irony was bitter. The most privileged women in the empire, daughters of sultans, sisters of rulers, mothers of dynasties, were also among its most oppressed. Their gilded lives were prisons, their wealth was a mask, their power was an illusion. They were survivors of a system that perfected institutional gaslighting centuries before the term existed. A system that told them their suffering was honor, that their exploitation was duty, that their cages were palaces. So when we look back on the Ottoman court, we must strip away the glittering illusions. We must remember that behind every jeweled crown was a terrified girl. Behind every marriage contract was a stolen childhood. Behind every story of privilege was a darker truth of pain and control. These were not fairy tales. They were horror stories written in silk and blood. The story of the Ottoman princesses does not end inside the palace walls. Their lives echo across centuries, leaving behind a legacy both haunting and invisible. Because what happened to them was not just personal tragedy, it was a political system so refined, so polished in its cruelty, that it outlived the empire itself. The Ottoman court has long fascinated the outside world. Painters, travelers, and storytellers described it as a realm of sensual luxury, golden chambers, perfumed gardens, women draped in jewels. But those were illusions. Behind the painted screens and veils lay something darker, a machine built on fear, a machine that turned girls into treaties, wives into weapons, and mothers into pawns. It was not crude barbarism. It was carefully engineered exploitation, dressed in silk and sanctified by ritual. And it worked. The system held for centuries, binding empires, securing alliances, and keeping dynasties alive. But its cost was measured in stolen childhoods, broken bodies, and silenced voices. The princesses who survived it were not heroines in the fairy tale sense. They were not villains either. They were human beings forced to adapt, to mask their pain, to endure unspeakable pressures. Some became ruthless manipulators, turning the rules against their enemies. Others became silent ghosts, fading into the background of palace life. A few tried to nurture genuine love and humanity, but always under the shadow of political necessity. Their survival was not triumph, it was endurance. Perhaps the most chilling truth is how effective the system was at convincing its victims to uphold it. Women trained other women. Mothers prepared daughters. Older princesses became the ones who taught the younger how to bleed convincingly, how to perform intimacy, how to survive the theater of marriage. It was institutionalized trauma, passed down like heirlooms. And because it was dressed in gold and ritual, many of its victims could not even name it as abuse. They were told it was destiny, duty, privilege. The empire's brilliance lay in convincing them that their pain was an honor. The consequences did not vanish with the fall of the Ottoman throne. The idea that a woman's value lies in her purity survived. The belief that her wedding night determines her worth survived. The expectation that her body is an instrument of politics or family honor survived. These ideas seeped into legal codes, cultural traditions, and social norms, not only in the Middle East, but far beyond. They shaped marriages, inheritance laws, and gender roles across continents, and in many ways, they still shape them today. Think of the irony. The very women who seemed most privileged daughters of sultans, clothed in riches others could never dream of, were some of the most controlled, surveilled, and silenced people in history. Their cages were gilded, but cages nonetheless. And their suffering reminds us of a sobering truth. Power and privilege are not the same. Wealth does not guarantee freedom. Status does not protect from control. Sometimes, those who appear the most untouchable are the most trapped. So what do we learn from their silence? That history's fairy tales are often built on the backs of broken girls. That empires as dazzling as the Ottomans could only maintain their power through systematic control of women's bodies, and that the echoes of those systems continue to shape the world we live in. When you hear stories of royal romance, remember the fear behind the silken veils. When you see portraits of jeweled brides, remember the blood-stained sheets carried through palace halls. When you think of privilege, remember that it often hides suffering too deep to see. The princesses of the Ottoman court were not fairy tale heroines. They were survivors of a system that convinced them their pain was honor, and their stories demand that we look beyond the gold and jewels of history to see the human cost hidden beneath. Because these were not love stories. They were horror stories, wrapped in silk, performed in palaces, and disguised as celebrations. And the girls at their center deserved so much more than the gilded prisons history remembers as paradise.